through a little bit of how some of the wonderful panelists are looking at the industry and how their organizations are kind of thinking about how to deal with and how to see opportunity in a fast-growing sector within the space that has, frankly, a lot more potential active role than, for instance, solar has had in the industry up until now. To give some ideas from our numbers as recent as half two last year, there are about 5 million, a little over 5 million EVs total around the globe today. There's over 1 million within the US. I don't know the exact number offhand on that one for this instant, but it's something that started to really catch the eye of utilities in a way that's well beyond the kind of initial focus in 2012, 2011, 2010 when we were dealing with, when we were coming off of kind of high oil prices from a few years prior. So with that, I want to introduce our panelists. I'll start with Laura Pierpont, Director of Technology Strategy at Exelon. Could you give a little bit, maybe a little bit about yourself? And I'm kind of curious, and I'll ask this to everybody, what you see as kind of the greatest opportunity for your organization associated with kind of the adoption of EVs and the growth curve attached to it?
Great question. Okay, well, thanks so much, Ben. I appreciate it. As mentioned, Laura Pierpont, Director of Technology Strategy. I think you've heard from a couple of my colleagues today throughout our Exelon companies, but my role is really at the corporate level to think about technologies as they're coming down the pipeline. And part of what my team does is to make sure that we shape these technology opportunities into things that are truly beneficial for our company and at the end of the day, our customers, rather than just waiting for them to assault us as threats. So I think that's one of the reasons that I really love the title of this panel, because while in some sense, yes, we're bracing for EV adoption, we're also very enthusiastically supporting it. And there's a lot that my team and other folks throughout Exelon are doing in that regard. So by way of introduction, a couple of additional quick points. I run our R&D program. We work with universities and national labs on early-ish stage technology development, but also things that are beneficial immediately. We also invest in storage companies through Volta Energy Technologies, of which we are one of the strategic partners. And that's just a smattering of activities that my team undertakes on behalf of Exelon Corporate. In terms of what really excites us around electric vehicles, the thing that I've been spending a lot of my time on lately is charging infrastructure. So really thinking about the innovative ways that we can think about where and how to deploy it, and also what those configurations will look like. And particularly when it comes to storage, where again, we're making some interesting investments throughout a range of technology development levels, we're asking ourselves, how is storage going to play a role in the electrification process that's so important to support EVs? So I'll be happy to talk a little bit more about that.
And just to clarify, when you say charging, you're talking mostly on the public side, correct?
We are, although obviously we're thinking about charging for our customers as well in their homes and how we can support those activities too.
Yeah. Excellent. Yeah. Adam, I'll let you introduce yourself as well.
Sure.
And a little bit on kind of how you see, I would say obviously it's pretty obvious to say what the opportunity is for BMW.
Yeah.
But maybe how you see EV integration opportunities kind of developing.
Sure. So my name is Adam Langton. I work for BMW. I'm based here in California. We have a research center in Silicon Valley, and so I work there. And I'm on the EV team. And my role is to help develop products related to our electric vehicles that support the grid. So that would be smart charging and stationary storage are two examples. And in terms of the opportunity that we see at BMW for electric vehicles, it's definitely an opportunity to further our sustainability mission. I think that's kind of obvious on the surface when you're talking about switching fuels. But for us, we've really drilled down on that and taken that as a pillar for our I-brand vehicles. When we started developing our I-brand vehicles from scratch, we had sustainability as one of the main features that we were pursuing in the design concept. So we looked at bringing in as much renewable energy as we could into the production process, improving the production process so that we were more efficient, reducing the amount of water we used, and using sustainable materials as often as we could within the vehicle, using carbon fiber to make the vehicle lighter so that you could get more range out of the battery. So we looked throughout the production process and the kind of the upstream part of the supply chain to identify opportunities to make that more sustainable. So now my role is kind of an extension of that. So I'm looking at now beyond the vehicle, what we can do is, obviously there is when you're using the vehicle, you fuel switch, so there's a sustainability benefit. But looking downstream of that, you can look at smart charging as a way to get even more environmental benefits from your electric vehicle. And then beyond the life of the vehicle, using batteries in their second life as grid storage, so you can get additional environmental benefits there as well. So I've been exploring that. So that's an interesting opportunity for us as a company. And I think the other opportunity that I explore a lot as well is how we get the vehicle more connected within the customer's life, but also within the electricity grid. And I think I'll have opportunities to talk about that more as we present. So I'll stop there.
And Jennifer?
So my name is Jennifer Lee. I work for Southern California Edison, and I am part of what we call the Grid Technologies and Modernization Organization. But stepping back a little bit bigger picture, kind of how do we fit into things? California has very aggressive greenhouse gas reduction goals, as I'm sure is not a surprise to anyone. And in 2017, we issued a white paper that was Pathway to 2030, where we had analyzed how can we achieve 40% reductions in greenhouse gases in the state from 1990 levels by 2030. So we have a great modeling team, and they looked at all sorts of scenarios. And the scenarios that they came up with were first to decarbonize the grid, so produce 80% of the electricity from carbon-free sources. And then second, and that's really why we're here, it was to electrify transportation. And the benefits to electrifying transportation were enormous. So we are bracing and for the implementation of electric vehicles, but it's really one of our pillars for how we see that we will get there. So to sort of give you a benchmark for the state of California, what does that look like? That looks like by 2030, electrifying about 24% of the passenger vehicles, or 7 million electric vehicles on the road. That's 180,000 medium and vans and 22,000 heavy-duty vehicles. So that kind of gives you the model of where we're going. So now, to me, I lead the Emerging Technology and Valuation team, where we are looking at the infrastructure that it will take to support that. So we look at things like vehicle to grid and have been doing an awful lot of demonstration projects.
Excellent. And Fouad, you want to round us out?
Thank you. Hello, my name is Fouad Degar. I am with National Grid. And for those of you who are not familiar with National Grid is a US and the UK based company. We have three major pillars, if I may describe it that way. We have the UK pillar, we have the US regulated UK, regulated US, and then we have a National Grid Ventures and Partners pillar, which is looking at venture capitalist investment in venture capital project, and also in innovation. I sit on the innovation side of the house, looking at customer innovation, and also on grid innovation. So just like what Jennifer said, I could say ditto for what she said. We have a major goal for reducing greenhouse gases in all three states that we operate in the Northeast, Massachusetts, New York, and Rhode Island. And we do have also a 40% by 2030 greenhouse gas emission reduction in greenhouse gases. And we too see that in order to achieve that is through the electrification of the transportation sector. We have been doing great on the energy efficiency, if I may say, #1 in the in the United States in energy efficiency program. But then also we need to be #1 in the transportation sector and electrify the transportation sector. And we look at light duty vehicles is to be, by 2030, we need to have almost 100% of the new vehicles and the light duty vehicles to be electric in order to achieve these goals. So we have a very short period of time to achieve such an aggressive goal for greenhouse gas reduction.
I'm actually curious from, both Jennifer and Fouad, you mentioned kind of the necessity for transport to be part of your greenhouse gas goals. What is success from what your respective organizations are able to push or nudge the industry and your customers on? Because a lot of EVs are going to happen no matter what. But what are the metrics you're looking at from the incentives you're developing or the charging infrastructure that you're putting in? How are you gauging, this worked really well, this is something that we need to adjust?
So we have several programs. We started with the Charge Ready pilot, and so the metrics on that are more than 1,000 chargers installed in over 60 sites. And so we see that kind of infrastructure installation as the key to adoption. So overall, if we look at, I said 7 million passenger vehicles, that I think translates to about 3.5 or 4 million in SCE's service territory. So we track the level of adoption. And then as we move into kind of the next generation, it's going to be more working in the infrastructure for heavy duty. So we'll measure success on transit bus electrification. And for us, that's a huge pollution reduction in some of our communities that have been impacted by bus pollution. So it's a big, complex suite of things.
Yeah, and so actually when, we'll go to you, Fouad. Let me maturate on that a little bit. I did have a follow-up there. I'll come back to it.
So yes, what's our role in here is that, look, we can sit and watch and be reactive, or we can take a leadership position and be proactive. We have decided to take a leadership position and be proactive and lead in this space. And ultimately, maybe if we wait and see, it will happen on its own. But we would like to see the acceleration of that transformation of the electrification of the transportation sector, rather than waiting for it to happen. Now, the major part that we see ourselves doing in that transformation is a collaboration. It is a collaborative effort that we have to work together on. It is not the utility alone. It is not the car manufacturer. It is not the consumers or the customers. It is all of us, including the policymakers, including the regulators, is that we need to be collaborating and working all together. And National Grid has been doing this quite a bit, and in the work that we've done back in 2000, I want to say 11 or 12, where we collaborated with ChargePoint, at the time used to be Coulomb Energy, and we installed 150 electric vehicle charging stations that the company owned on customer property. And it's like, why are we doing that? That was the question, and it is to transform the market. That's what we're trying to do.
From a partnership and collaboration perspective, is there any kind of initial targets that maybe you have kind of looked at from a stations development perspective, or from a getting closer to the customer and getting a better ability to do education through dealerships or through local programs? Is there kind of initial group of folks that utilities should be looking at first? And Laura, you're nodding. It sounds like you might want to jump in.
Yeah, so absolutely. In fact, that's an area where we have been very explicitly working, is around the direct customer engagement and helping them understand what it means to buy an electric vehicle, giving them the resources to assess the options out there. That was something that we identified fairly early on as being a bit of a challenge, is that, in some cases, dealerships are not that well equipped to actually help customers make those kinds of decisions. So that's something that we're very proactively going after as a way to support this future, is to really help our customers go in that direction. And that, of course, complements our other activities around things like charging infrastructure.
And is there an iterative process with that? When I think of, talking to my family, which is, I don't have Shay's family. No one's an engineer. I do have one chem major, though. When I talk to my family about EVs, I have my one nephew who's very excited about anything related to Tesla. But beyond that, first question is, it's going to run out of energy. And then there's about 17 others that are, basically like, there's no way this will work. Sure. As some of those initial concerns drop out, are you checking in with kind of where your customers are at, or finding ways to understand and evaluate, hey, range anxiety isn't a problem anymore. I actually need to be talking about how maintenance works, and really, like, winters are really bad in Chicago. You need to make sure that you're plugging your vehicle in when you're heating it before you get in it. Things like that. How is your team thinking about that customer education kind of flow?
Yeah. No, that's a great question. I think part of what we're really paying attention to is the fact that all of our customers are different. And I think there has been this tendency among utilities to think about customers in extraordinarily large blocks, so as much as, residential versus commercial versus industrial. And so this is actually a much bigger conversation we're having throughout the company, not just in the context of electric vehicles, but really in so many other ways. Our customers' expectations are changing. They really want to interact in different ways with their technology. We have more of an ability to help understand where our customers are and meet them with exactly the sorts of products and services and ultimately answers that they really want. So this is a larger effort around how do we think about customer segmentation, how far do we have to go in terms of really, working with different kinds of groups and ensuring that we're meeting their needs. But that's obviously something that comes to the fore very quickly when you're talking about selling an electric vehicle.
And within your organization, would that be something that would involve like the BIDA side of things and trying to get a better view of the customer, or is that something that's more interacting with firms that do market research on direct customer kind of opinions and education, things like that?
It's absolutely all of the above. So we're really hitting on all pistons in terms of how we think about communications holistically, how we think about individual technology solutions, and for us, how things are different among our regions and our operating companies.
I'd like to add just one thing there. One of your questions was, you gave this example of the interest and the demand for EVs and kind of the questions that you see on your side. And I think we do see a lot of that there's concerns about range anxiety. It seems like if you're very interested in the environmental benefits or the technology, you will get a BEV and you'll be drawn to that. But I think one opportunity that we haven't emphasized enough would be the plug-in hybrid. And I think this can help with getting folks that are not attracted by the environmental benefits. That's just not something that they weigh heavily. And it can be a way to get them into an EV so that their next vehicle after that is a BEV. And I think also we sometimes underestimate the number of electric miles that you can really get from a BEV. Mm-hmm. We often look at what the capacity of the battery is compared to the capacity of the gas tank, and we assume that's what the electric miles you're going to get are. But I operate a smart charging pilot in the San Francisco Bay Area, and I have PHEVs that participate in that, and they get about a third of their miles from electric, even though the battery is smaller than a third of their total range. So I think there's an opportunity there that I would hope that utilities and state policy would emphasize a little bit more, and it doesn't have to do that at the expense of BEVs, but just adding more emphasis on that, not as a inferior technology, but as something that gets people that otherwise wouldn't buy an electric vehicle into the cars.
So I'm going to mention one thing. We have about 15 questions right now, which we will not get to all of them. But I will encourage people, if there are ones you really like, upvote them, and we will get to those. So it's all in your guys' hands. So hopefully they're good questions. One thing before we get into these, I did want to ask one other question. Adam, BMW has a tremendous amount of clout because they have a dealership network, because they have deep customer relationships that is with an asset that people see daily, touch daily. Obviously, energy we also touch daily, but most of us don't. Most of us not in this room do not think about our utility company daily. We think about our company, weekly, monthly, et cetera, usually when the bill comes. So how is looking at your dealership network and coming from being somebody focused on EVs within BMW for some time, how are they working to kind of get the sales force or specialists or folks that have a really strong idea of how these vehicles work and will operate with a customer? How are they pushing that knowledge transfer down into dealerships that might sell fewer than a few hundred, or even maybe fewer than 10 in a year?
Yeah, it's a challenge for us because it's something new. It's still something new. It's a challenge for dealerships because in our case, most of our vehicles are not electric vehicles. So you have to identify who is a potential candidate to buy an electric vehicle and be able to show them those technologies and compare them. We try to do a lot of things with the ride and drive events. We've worked with utilities in California to offer discounts through our dealerships that we work with the utilities on to help then use the utilities' ability to communicate with customers and our ability to communicate with customers to kind of come together and get more people behind the wheel in electric vehicles. The other thing that we've done is we set a target many years ago of having all of our normal vehicles, all of our vehicle lines, have a hybrid option. And that can become a really powerful option. For the 5 Series, plug-in hybrid was priced the same as the regular 5 Series. So we've done things like that to be able to put it in front of the customer and say, well, you can buy a regular 5 Series or you can buy the PHEV version, and they're the same price. So we've done things like that that make it easier for a dealer to have a conversation with the customer about that. But it's still challenging. It's understanding, customers ask what's the rate impact, and so that's still a challenge to be able to communicate that. But we've improved kind of the offerings that we have for charging stations, and some of that we're exploring new solutions there that'll make it easier for a household to install a charging station after they buy the vehicle. So things like that are things that we've really been focused on.
If I may, I would like to add something to that. In the 3 states that we're operating in, New York, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island, is that we noticed that customer awareness, customer education is needed. So we put rate filings in all the 3 states, and one of the components we put in it is for customer education and awareness. And I'll give you an example of my own experience when I went to buy an plug-in hybrid electric vehicle. I went to the dealer and talking to them about buying the car. I was really astonished by the lack of information that the dealership gave me regarding what's available for incentive, what's available from the state, what's available from the utilities. And so it is that awareness and education is really, really needed, and we identified that in our pathway paper to be a key element to do that. So like what you're doing, we have been doing Ride and Drive in the communities, working with the state's offices who's responsible for the zero emission vehicle initiatives, and trying to bring people to test the cars and encourage them, and working, of course, with the dealerships and the car manufacturers. So that has been successful, but not enough.
So as I said, we have a lot of questions.
All right.
Some of these I think we can probably get through a little bit rapid fire because they're pretty short answers, but one of them was, has your organization explored utilities selling and rate basing electric vehicles as grid infrastructure? I could see that maybe working. Obviously, it works in the way of field force. If you have utility trucks that are
We're
EVs.
exploring it from a fleet perspective.
Okay.
And the fleet of the future. If you went to it, we actually have run the largest electric vehicle fleet since, I think, 1996. So electrifying our own fleet has been one of our key focuses, and that's how we're kind of advancing that infrastructure, although we're now turning more to, we're not in the driver's seat, right, as you alluded to, of customers' adoption. We don't, I didn't mean a pun, but anyway. So it's enabling, and so our turn has been to infrastructure, but electrifying our own fleet has been a huge part of our plan.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. We've sort of explored philosophically a couple of different potential options for how to configure systems like this. So another example would be one where maybe we own the battery in your car, but the rest of the car is yours. But this is a piece that is sort of a utility infrastructure element. I think we're still a long way from really deeply considering those options. Right now, the focus is, as you can imagine, on charging infrastructure, since that has a more direct tie-in with the utility infrastructure as it stands.
Yeah, I feel like it's hard because you could think of a 5-10 years, well, let's go with 10 to 15 years, because I'll be honest, I'm scared of an autonomous driving vehicle. But if you start thinking about shared vehicles that are moving people around, you could see a utility being the one running that. I would still suggest it's probably going to be a logistics company. That's not our strength. The charging components of it, where it goes to charge, when it goes to charge, that's something that there probably would be I would assume some type of automated handshake. But to dive down on this question a little bit more, outside of the EV side, on the charging side, I have seen some munis say, we'll give you the charger. We control it between 5 and 9 p.m. We throttle it down. And I personally love this statement because I think it's good marketing. It might not be as good as I think, but we'll throttle it down to level 1. It's not off, it's level 1, which is half as good as level 2, kind of. But is that something you've explored at all, looking at, through a regulated arm, maybe either owning owning an EV charger that might be a residential EV charger, or owning workplace chargers that are on commercial sites. Sounds like you guys already have done that a little bit.
That's a huge part, but we don't actually own it. We are installing and covering the cost of installation for certain transport. Charge Ready is this big, huge thing that I could take up the whole rest of your time. But we're supporting the installation. And then probably what we do that's most important is we'll take startups to deal with managed charging. And so, for example, we have some incredibly creative startups that will have PV on the roof. They've made charging in their parking structures ubiquitous, so it's everywhere. And you come in and plug in an app, and when you're going to leave, then they use actually an open source AI algorithm to balance the infrastructure. So those are more the kinds of things we're looking at. And then in our next round of, I've heard people refer to the electric program investment charge, where we demonstrate pre-commercial technologies. We're looking at, and this would be potentially utility owned, adding a battery to these workplace charging systems so you can smooth the charging rate.
And I'll say that's one of the few things that I think the acronym is actually more famous than the actual words underneath it. So it's the EPIC funds in
I
California.
try to be careful.
Yeah, no, I would completely agree with you. Usually the acronyms are not helpful, but in that case, I feel like everyone uses EPIC. Laura, did you have a comment on the resi charging side?
Yeah, I mean, certainly just agree that I think, this is a key point, is trying to figure out exactly how we do this in a way that ultimately is beneficial to the grid and therefore to our customers across the board. That's a really key focus of how we're thinking about deploying these kinds of technologies.
And have any of you seen any movement on a regulated utility owning resi charging in any discussions you had or forums you've been in? I've seen deregulated for sure. I mean, Enel made a pretty big splash with a low cost, I think with some weird T&Cs, but a very low cost lease. First Energy has a program for that as well that's pretty broad. But
it feels like in the single family residential space, there's not many challenges to the investment itself. I mean, there are hurdles to getting it installed and understanding what that takes. And the utility could be valuable in that process. But I think that in the apartment or multi-unit dwelling context or workplace, there are real challenges to getting someone to make that investment. And so for there seems to be a pretty clear role that utility could help in that.
And that's exactly where we're taking our programs, our investment in the filings, and some of the investment is into the multi-dwelling building, where we own the infrastructure and we pay an incentive to the building owner or operator to install that EV charging. See, we again talk about collaboration and working together. We're not in the business of owning the EV charging station, and so we want to work with the equipment manufacturer and the installer and let them own it. We don't want to compete in that space. That's not where we excel and do. But in certain situations, we see ourselves owning and operating these units. DC fast charging stations, for example, are an area that we need to understand and experiment with, and so we will be owning some of those things as well. As a point to the earlier question you talked about on home charging, and the previous panel or presentation was about the New York Con Edison program about smart home. Rate. We do have that, and we're trying to encourage people for voluntary time of use for their EV. We have a reward program similar to what was mentioned for the Con Ed program. We offer rebates or rewards to customers for shifting or their charging time. So we're trying to come up with some creative, smart home rate to encourage people to adopt electric vehicle and not burn their pockets, a hole in their pockets for paying for them.
And I would just add from California's perspective, I think everyone in the room probably knows all about the duck curve. And so the last thing, we're really trying to drive workplace charging, daytime charging when we have excess electricity in the system, and the policy around that with time of use rates.
Yeah, it's a particularly interesting problem that hasn't hit a lot of areas, but
Right.
there are states where if you can get people to charge during the day, it's a a fantastic opportunity.
So to allude to one of the earlier panels, they said, you know, EVs can either be a resource for the grid or a huge cost, even depending on what side of the street, and we're really trying to align our approach to making them a resource for the grid.
On that note, we actually are doing a pilot with PG&E where we're exploring how we can get a set of vehicles that are doing smart charging, how we can get them to do more daytime charging. And it's an interesting opportunity for the OEM to then partner with the utility because you need that infrastructure at the workplace, and there's a utility role for that. You need to identify when you want more daytime charging. And the interesting role that an OEM can play is that if you really want to get more daytime charging, you actually have to reduce nighttime charging. Because if somebody wakes up with a battery that's 100% full and then drives to work, you know, the average commute to work is going to be somewhere around 30 miles. So you're looking at 15 miles each way or so. So that's not a lot of load then that you can take off. But if you can get somebody to charge less at night with the assurance that they will be able to charge during the day, and then give them the right incentives during the day, you can get a lot more load to shift from nighttime to daytime. And it's really an issue in the fall and the spring here in California, particularly this spring, when temperatures were cooler, so there was not as much air conditioning that was needed. There was a lot more rain in the early spring, so there's a lot of hydropower. So in March and April, during most hours, daytime hours, renewable energy was exceeding the total demand for electricity during most days in March and April.
Yep, that's our daily negative pricing.
Yes, so it's a huge challenge.
And it's a huge challenge, and so that's EVs as a potential resource.
Yeah, and it affects not just EVs, but then if we want to increase renewable integration onto the grid, we're getting closer and closer to a point where that becomes harder and harder if we're relying on solar, which is the most abundant source of energy. So this is where the two pieces, EVs, which are reducing carbon on one side, and renewables, which are reducing on another industry, can come together.
I think.
Please go ahead.
I was going to say there's another dimension to this challenge too, which is important, which is that we really think about a lot of these issues in the context of gasoline-fueled cars, and that's kind of our paradigm for how the transportation system works. So I think there's some really interesting questions here around, you know, how are people's relationships going to change with how they think about fueling their vehicles, and what does that mean in terms of the opportunities and the challenges, particularly for utilities, but for OEMs and others too, to really bring to bear new kinds of technologies, new business models, new ways to make the system as a whole really work better. And so that's a big part of what we're focused on as well, is thinking about not just, you know, how do we create the right tariff structures and sort of move things a little bit in the right direction, but are there some really creative, completely different new technologies, some ways of integrating storage as a best practice, those sorts of things that we can invest in and really make sure that, again, this system as a whole works for everyone.
So Ben, one area that we haven't really talked about this as a panel, but it is very important for us as a utility, and as most of you know, is that we have no options for who to serve and not to serve. So we have to serve all customers regarding of their status. So a lot of our efforts recently been focused on how do we reach the disadvantaged communities and bring the transportation, the electrification of the transportation sector to those communities as well. And the last mile driven around in that area, you know, whether it is the public transportation, whether it is the transit system or the rail system, whatever it is, the school buses. So we're looking at how do we make an impact in that space, and what, you know, we see around here, mostly I saw quite a bit of them last night and this morning, the electric scooters. And those are becoming new means for people to drive or to go to transport to the last mile. So what is our role in the electric utilities for helping the disadvantaged community as well as into the last mile? That's where we're spending quite a bit of our time.
Yeah, well, and I feel like that's a discussion that is going to come in phases. Like, we don't have there's no cheap EV that's below 20K right now. You're looking at stuff that's, you know, several years old, that's somewhat degrading, but I'm sure still quite good cars, to be able to get something in that range. So it's going to be a little while before we have an extensive penetration in disadvantaged areas. But it's interesting you mentioned micromobility and school buses and things like that, because those opportunities are there. There's schools everywhere. There's buses in most places outside of, you know, deep inner cities. So, talking about buses, I know, Jennifer, you're doing a lot of work there.
We are.
What does that look like for you? Because you guys have a mandate by, is it 2030? Or California's phasing out gasoline buses, right?
They are, and we're working with a lot of the transit areas. So that's not where I am the deepest. So I'm in the technology, so it's like the VO2 grid and things like that. But I do know part of our Charge Ready 2 filing that is pending includes the electrification of school buses and then a heavy duty focus on mass transit in exactly the kind of communities that you're talking about to more equitably serve.
Right.
But I really liked what you said, so I want to go back to, I think it's really important for us to think about that vehicles are going to change and their place in our life are going to change. So I know, I'm on the older end of folks in here. As soon as there's an autonomous driving vehicle, it's going to drop me off at work and I'm going to send it off to Uber. That's a completely different vision of how you use that asset. But I've always looked at it like an industrial engineer, which is, it's got a utilization of less than 2%. I drive it to work, it's 2 miles away. I think everything's going to be different. So I think that's really a good way to start thinking about it. The paradigm's going to shift.
I think one of the things that interests me along those lines is it's going to be, the EV discussion is different than solar in that it will be more common across the country. Not perfect. California's still going to have a lot more than Arkansas is, but it's something that will hit every utility in a much more consistent timeline, where TVA is not looking at significant solar investments until the mid-2020s. So I think the micromobility discussion is particularly interesting because that one is actually something that changes the transport discussion a lot, especially in southern climates. Or I should say, climates with more Mediterranean type of a view, because within an SE, you could use a scooter most of the year without having to wear a massive coat and bring along some of the gear that you see in Northern Europe. So yeah.
You can still do that in New York.
Yeah.
It's not an EV discussion, but I still want to know why Copenhagen has better bike lanes than I do in Huntington Beach. It's just a little personal.
They've created a culture.
They have created a culture.
A hard culture to create here, but I will say in New York, they've actually done a fantastic job of starting to get the bike side going. And I liked the person who's taken over the EV initiative for the city. She came over from the bike initiative, and their entire success factor was, do they have any mothers and children riding in the bike lanes? And it simply was, if mothers and children feel safe, then we did a good job of designing the bike lane that it's safe enough for people to actually ride in. And I would actually extend that to if you have scooters, you have electric bikes, et cetera, as a micromobility option right now. And I would say it gets a little far-fetched because the number of people that are hurt or are unfortunately killed compared to the number of people that are just killed walking across the street is still much lower. But having those dedicated lanes allows for those other opportunities and a much easier transition. So, did want to ask a few of the questions we have down here. One of the questions we had was around regulatory policies. If you could dream up one regulatory policy to really kickstart EVs, which would obviously have positive impacts on all of you, what is the one EV policy you wish was there to really push? And I'm going to say free, like an incentive that makes them free does not count.
So if I may start, I think having a price on carbon emission is a policy that is really we're looking for. Thank you. And the proceeds from that can be used, and I talked about electrification of the transit system, the buses and school buses. The communities, the school systems are really don't have a lot of money to spend on buses, moving from the diesel to electric buses. So if we can have a price on carbon emission and use that as an example to fund the transportation sector, helping the disadvantaged community, the school system, the transit, that is one policy I think would be useful. And it cannot be only for one city or one state. We have to start looking at it at the macro level as well. Start maybe on the micro, but then we'll have to move over to the macro level in order to be effective. So that's what I would say policy is needed.
Any I wouldn't say dissenters, but alternative views?
In terms of a policy related to smart charging, I'll take a kind of a narrower approach to that question. Because California's been exploring this for a while. What I would want is a technology agnostic program that pays you for the grid benefits that you create across a spectrum of grid benefits. So looking at demand response or over-generation services, frequency regulation, distribution services, things like that. Any of those, it just kind of puts a value on those and allows you with whatever technology you want to go out and create services there that a utility will contract for. And right now the policies don't allow for that. I guess another aspect of that would be treating smart charging the same way that we treat storage. It obviously can't discharge, so it has some limits, but it can still perform many of the same services that storage does.
One thing I will say is there's at least one retailer in Texas where you can get a little bit of that direct value. But that direct value is you're exposed to wholesale prices. And they can go up to thousands of dollars a megawatt hour,
Sure.
which can be a little hard to digest if you happen to misalign your preferences on your automation system.
Sure, yeah, maybe that's a reasonable risk to put out there. I'm not sure, but it would be nice if the programs were not specifying that you have to have a charging station. They also allowed us to collaborate. So with the smart charging program that I can do, I can manage the charging wherever the vehicle goes because I'm using the vehicle telematics system to do that. So if it's at home or away from home, any of that, we can manage that. So if there's opportunities to collaborate with workplace charging or utilities in that would really help jumpstart that space.
I'll allow one more response on this one, if there is one. Okay.
I'd like to just say one, then
30
mine
seconds.
is 30 seconds.
Great.
Electrifying transportation has a lot of benefits in addition to carbon reduction. And as someone who lives in South Coast with two men who are asthmatic, I'd like to see policy account for not just the carbon reduction and the other things, but the benefits of reducing NOx, which are enormous.
So we have a little over 2 minutes, so we're going to try and do some of these pretty quick. What are the kind of biggest difficulties or challenges associated with deploying public charging? And I would say maybe one sentence, or you could even just say like the 2-word answer. I would actually like to get each of your opinions, what you think the most difficult part is, because 3 of the 4 of you have done some public charging as organizations. So Laura, do you want to start us off?
Man, well, I don't know about the most difficult, but one that we're definitely trying to tackle head on right now is the question around just where to put it. So really getting a thorough understanding of not just what do we think the curve will look like at a very big macro level for electric vehicle adoption, but where is that adoption going to take place? And then how do we balance trying to serve the needs of those early adopter customers with the fact that we have this requirement to, again, serve all of our customers equally and to make sure that there's equality in how we're actually producing services.
So I thought there for a second you were going to get it in one sentence because you had the run-on going for a little bit, and you lost the run-on.
But then I took a breath.
I do appreciate the efforts on run-on sentences when you're given a one-sentence goal. So Adam, bonus points if you can keep it to one sentence.
Curbside charging in urban areas is an opportunity to create very visible charging that people can see, and it can be a reminder that it's available, but there isn't a clear solution that I've seen to put that in place.
Well done. Well done. Bonus points, guys. Take note for your answers. Jennifer.
I would suggest that it is complex to install charging in public spaces and requires a lot of collaboration and stakeholder engagement with parties with high disparate interests.
So let me try to bring it down. Upfront cost is my answer.
There you go.
Okay. I think I'm actually going to steal this from the audience, so I apologize, guys. I do want to follow up on your comment, Jennifer. Have we learned from the customer engagement efforts that we've had the last 10 years in this industry to the point where we're ready for that type of stakeholder engagement? Or is this something that's going to take a few years to really knock out and understand?
I would have to answer that we are getting ready for it, we are staffing for it, we are putting kind of the marketing segmented resources in place to really understand our customers on a granular level, but I'm not going to put a year on it, but I would call it a work in progress.
Do either of you feel like your organizations are ready to go on that stakeholder side?
We are. I think the goals that we have in the states that I speak in the states that we serve, we do have ZEV goals, and we don't have time because the ZEV goals are 2025, and we're fastly approaching, and we're not there yet. So we cannot wait for much longer.
I like the confidence.
Yeah.
We're a little over one sentence this time.
Got it. I would